What if I told you that the wisest man who ever lived made the most foolish decision in history? Picture this, a young king kneeling in the desert sand, asking God for nothing but wisdom. God is so impressed that he grants him not only supernatural intelligence, but also wealth beyond measure and fame that would echo through millennia. This king builds a temple so magnificent, covered in 23 tons of pure gold, that visitors fall to their knees in awe. His judgments are so brilliant that people travel thousands of miles just to hear him speak. Kings and queens bow before him. His name, Solomon. But here's the twist that will shake you to your core. This same man who could solve any problem, who wrote thousands of proverbs about wisdom, who had everything, ends his life as a broken king who lost God's favor. How? Through one unstoppable obsession. Women, not just a few, but 1,000 women, who slowly, deliberately turned the heart of the wisest man away from the God who gave him everything. This is not just a story about power and pleasure. This is a warning about how even the greatest can fall. Welcome to the rise and catastrophic fall of King Solomon. Solomon's story begins in the shadow of his father's greatest sin. King David, the man after God's own heart, had made a terrible mistake. One evening, as we read in 2 Samuel 11, David saw a beautiful woman bathing from his rooftop. Her name was Bathsheba, and she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's most loyal soldiers. David sent for her, slept with her, and she became pregnant. When David couldn't cover up what he had done, he arranged for Uriah to be killed in battle. He sent a letter with Uriah himself, instructing Joab to put Uriah in the front lines, where the fighting was fiercest, then pull back so he would be struck down and die. The plan worked. Uriah died in battle, never knowing he was carrying his own death sentence. After Bathsheba mourned for her husband, David brought her to his palace and married her. It seemed like David had gotten away with it, but 2 Samuel 11:27 says, something chilling, but the thing David had done displeased the Lord. God sent the prophet Nathan to confront the king. Nathan came to David and told him a story about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb. David was furious at this injustice, not realizing Nathan was talking about him. Then Nathan spoke those devastating words in 2 Samuel 12:7. You are the man. God's judgment was clear. The sword would never depart from David's house, and the child born from this sin would die. The baby became sick. David fasted and prayed desperately for the child's life, lying on the ground all night, refusing to eat. 2 Samuel 12:8 tells us the baby died on the 7th day. The servants were afraid to tell David, thinking he might do something terrible to himself. But when David saw them whispering, he knew. He asked them directly, "Is the child dead?" They answered, "He is dead." Then David did something that shocked everyone. He got up from the ground, washed himself, put on fresh clothes, and went to the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went home and asked for food. His servants couldn't understand. David explained in 2 Samuel 12:23, "But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Then something unexpected happened. David went to comfort Bathsheba in her grief. 2 Samuel 12:4 says, "Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and made love to her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon." This wasn't just another baby. This was a fresh start. This was God's grace breaking through judgment. Out of the ashes of their sin and sorrow, God gave them Solomon. The name David chose for his son carried deep meaning. Solomon comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace. This was significant because David had been a warrior his entire life. He had killed Goliath as a boy with just a sling and a stone. He had spent years running from King Saul, hiding in caves, living like a fugitive. He had fought battle after battle to establish Israel's kingdom. His hands were covered in blood from all the enemies he had defeated. 1 Chronicles 22:8 records God's words to David, "You have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight." David was a man of war, but this son would be different. This son would bring peace to Israel. However, there was another name given to this child, a name even more special. 2 Samuel 12:2 tells us, "And because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedidiah." Jedidiah means beloved of the Lord. Think about that for a moment. This child, born from adultery and murder, born after his older brother died as divine punishment, was now called beloved of the Lord. It was the same prophet Nathan who had pronounced judgment on David, who now came back with a message of love. God could have rejected this child. God could have treated him as tainted by his parents' sin. But instead, God chose him. God loved him. God gave him a special name. 2 names for one boy. Solomon, the name everyone would call him, spoke of his earthly destiny. Jedidiah, the name God called him, spoke of his standing before heaven. From the very beginning, before Solomon did anything to deserve it, God marked him as special. But Solomon didn't grow up as an only child with a clear path to the throne. King David had many wives, and with many wives came many sons. The palace was crowded with princes, each one thinking he might be the next king. There was Amnon, David's firstborn son through Ahinoam. As the oldest, Amnon had the strongest claim to the throne, but Amnon brought shame to the family. 2 Samuel chapter 13 records how Amnon became obsessed with his half-sister Tamar, who was Absalom's full sister. Amnon pretended to be sick and asked for Tamar to come make him food. When she came to his room, he raped her, then immediately hated her and threw her out. Then there was Absalom, Tamar's full brother. 2 Samuel 14:25 says, "In all Israel there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him." Absalom was beautiful, charismatic, and incredibly ambitious. He waited 2 full years, then invited Amnon to a sheep-shearing festival. There, Absalom had his servants kill Amnon to avenge his sister. After the murder, Absalom fled and stayed away for 3 years. When he finally returned to Jerusalem, he wasn't satisfied with just being a prince. He wanted the throne. 2 Samuel 15 describes how Absalom would stand by the city gate and intercept people coming to see the king. He would tell them, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me and I would see that they receive justice." He was stealing the hearts of the people. Eventually, Absalom gathered an army and declared himself king. David had to flee Jerusalem. Father and son went to war. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim, and 20,000 men died that day. Absalom himself was riding his mule under a large oak tree when his head got caught in the thick branches. The mule kept going, leaving Absalom hanging in the air. Joab found him there and drove 3 javelins through his heart. When David heard that Absalom was dead, 2 Samuel 18:33 records his grief. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you." After Amnon and Absalom were gone, there was still Adonijah. Solomon grew up watching all of this. He saw his older brothers destroy themselves with their ambition and violence. Years passed, and King David grew old. 1 Kings 1:1 tells us, when King David was very old, he could not keep warm even when they put covers over him. His servants brought him a young woman named Abishag from Shunem to care for him and keep him warm. David was dying, and everyone in the palace knew it. The question on everyone's mind was, who would be the next king? With Amnon and Absalom dead, the next oldest son was Adonijah, and Adonijah, David's son by his wife Haggith, decided not to wait for his father to choose. 1 Kings 1:5 says, "Now Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, put himself forward and said, 'I will be king.' So he got chariots and horses ready with 50 men to run ahead of him. This was a bold move. Having 50 men run ahead of you was a sign of royalty, a public statement that you considered yourself king. Adonijah wasn't hiding his ambition, and he didn't just have confidence in himself. He had powerful allies. 1 Kings 1:7 tells us, "Adonijah conferred with Joab, son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar the priest, and they gave him their support." Joab was the commander of David's entire army. Abiathar was one of the 2 high priests. With these 2 men behind him, Adonijah had both military might and religious authority. Feeling confident, Adonijah decided to throw a coronation feast. He chose Enrozel, a spring just outside Jerusalem. There he sacrificed sheep, cattle, and fattened calves. 1 Kings 1:9 tells us exactly who he invited. Adonijah then sacrificed sheep, cattle, and fattened calves. At the stone of Zahaleth near Enrogel, he invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the royal officials of Judah. It was a massive celebration, but there were some very important people who were not invited. 1 Kings 1:10 lists them, but he did not invite Nathan the prophet, or Benaiah, or the special guard, or his brother Solomon. This wasn't an accident. Adonijah deliberately excluded everyone who might oppose him. By leaving them out, Adonijah was making it clear that this was a coup. He was declaring himself king while his father was still alive. But Adoniah had made a critical mistake. He had left out Nathan the prophet, and Nathan had no intention of letting this coup succeed. 1 Kings 1:11 records what happened next. Then Nathan asked Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, "Have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and our Lord David knows nothing about it?" The situation was urgent. If Adonijah succeeded, both Bathsheba and Solomon would likely be killed as threats to the new king. Nathan had a plan, but he needed Bathsheba to execute it. Nathan laid out the strategy. 1 Kings 1:12 records his words. "Now then, let me advise you how you can save your own life and the life of your son Solomon." Then he told her exactly what to say. 1 Kings 1:3 shows Nathan's instructions. "Go into King David and say to him, 'My lord the king, did you not swear to me your servant? Surely Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. Why then has Adonijah become king?'" Nathan promised that while she was still speaking with David, he would come in and confirm everything she said. So, Bathsheba went into David's chamber. The king was very old, lying in his bed, and the young woman Abishag was attending to him. When Bathsheba entered, she bowed low with her face to the ground. 1 Kings 1:16 says, Bathsheba bowed down, prostrating herself before the king. "What is it you want?" the king asked. Bathsheba didn't waste time. 1 Kings 1:17 records her words, "My lord, you yourself swore to me, your servant by the Lord your God, Solomon your son, shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, do not know about it." Then she laid out all the details. 1 Kings 1:18 and 19 tell us, "He has sacrificed great numbers of cattle, fattened calves and sheep, and has invited all the king's sons, the priest, and Joab the commander of the army. But he has not invited Solomon your servant." She ended with a warning in 1 Kings 1 verse 21. "My lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you, to learn from you who will sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise, as soon as my lord the king is laid to rest with his ancestors, I and my son Solomon will be treated as criminals." While Baba was still speaking, the servants announced that Nathan the prophet had arrived just as planned. Nathan came in and bowed before the king with his face to the ground. Then he confirmed everything Bae had said. 1 Kings 1:24 records his words. Nathan said, "Have you, my lord the king, declared that Adonijah shall be king after you, and that he will sit on your throne? Today he has gone down and sacrificed great numbers of cattle, fattened calves, and sheep. He has invited all the king's sons, the commanders of the army, and Athar the priest. Right now they are eating and drinking with him, and saying, 'Long live King Adonijah.' Babe, your servant, and Zadok the priest, and Benaiah son of Jehoiada, and your servant Solomon, he did not invite." David's response was immediate and powerful. 1 Kings 1:28 says, "Then King David said, 'Call in Bathsheba.' So she came into the king's presence and stood before him. David made an oath. 1 Kings 1, s. 29 and 30 record his solemn words. "The king then took an oath, 'As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon, your son, shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place.'" Bathsheba bowed low and said, "May my lord, King David, live forever." But David didn't stop with just words. He immediately gave orders. He called for Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah son of Jehoiada. 1 Kings 1, S 33 and 34. Record David's clear command. Take your Lord's servants with you, and have Solomon my son mount my own mule, and take him down to Gihon. There have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel. Blow the trumpet and shout, Long live King Solomon. Then you are to go up with him, and he is to come and sit on my throne and reign in my place. I have appointed him ruler over Israel and Judah. David wasn't taking chances. He specified his own mule, a clear symbol of royal approval. He named the exact location. He ordered a public anointing with trumpet blasts, and he made it clear that Solomon would sit on David's throne immediately. The faithful servants moved quickly. 1 Kings 1:38 tells us, So Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites and the Pelethites went down and had Solomon mount King David's mule, and they escorted him to Gihon. The Kerethites and Pelethites were David's elite personal bodyguard. Their presence sent a clear message. This had David's full authority and military backing. When they arrived at Gihon, Zadok took the horn of oil from the sacred tent. This was the same holy oil used to anoint kings and priests. 1 Kings 1:39 says, Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon. Then they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, Long live King Solomon! The moment the oil touched Solomon's head, he became king. What followed was a celebration unlike anything Jerusalem had seen. 1 Kings 1:40 describes it, and all the people went up after him, playing pipes and rejoicing greatly, so that the ground shook with the sound. The ground was shaking not from an earthquake, but from the sound of thousands of people celebrating. They were playing flutes and pipes, creating music that filled the air. This wasn't a small group. This was the entire city coming out to celebrate their new king. Meanwhile, at Enroyal, Adonijah's party was wrapping up. They had finished eating when they started to hear something. 1 Kings 1:41 says, Adonijah and all the guests who were with him heard it as they were finishing their feast. On hearing the sound of the trumpet, Joab asked, What's the meaning of all the noise in the city? Even as he was asking, Jonathan son of Abiathar the priest came running with news. Jonathan didn't sugarcoat the situation. 1 Kings 1:43 records his message. Not at all. Our Lord King David has made Solomon king. Then he gave them all the details. 1 Kings 1 S 44-46. Continue. The king has sent with him Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and they have put him on the king's mule. And Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet have anointed him king at Gihon. From there they have gone up cheering, and the city resounds with it. That's the noise you hear. Moreover, Solomon has taken his seat on the royal throne. But Jonathan wasn't finished. 1 Kings 1:47 tells us, Also the royal officials have come to congratulate our Lord King David, saying, May your God make Solomon's name more famous than yours, and his throne greater than yours. And the king bowed in worship on his bed. Jonathan delivered David's final words in 1 Kings 1:48, and the king said, Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has allowed my eyes to see a successor on my throne today. The party was over. 1 Kings 1:49 tells us, At this, all Adonijah's guests rose in alarm and dispersed. Everyone scattered. Adonijah was suddenly alone and terrified. He ran to the altar and grabbed the horns. 1 Kings 1:51 says, Then Solomon was told, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon and is clinging to the horns of the altar. He says, Let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. Solomon's response revealed his character. 1 Kings 1:52 records his reply. Solomon replied, If he shows himself to be worthy, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground. But if evil is found in him, he will die. Then Solomon sent men to bring Adonijah down. When Adonijah came and bowed before the new king, Solomon said just 2 words in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 53. Go to your home. Solomon was now king, but he was young and the responsibility was overwhelming. Shortly after his coronation, Solomon went to Gibeon to worship God. 1 Kings 3:4 tells us, The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar there. 1,000 burnt offerings. This wasn't a casual visit. This was serious worship. Solomon was seeking God with everything he had. Gibon was about 6 miles northwest of Jerusalem, and it was where the tabernacle and the bronze altar stood at that time. The temple hadn't been built yet, so this was the main place to worship God. That night, something extraordinary happened. 1 Kings 3:5 says, "At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, 'Ask for whatever you want me to give you.'" Can you imagine that moment? The creator of the universe was offering Solomon a blank check. Anything he wanted. Anything at all. This wasn't just a nice dream. This was God testing Solomon's heart. What would a young king ask for when given unlimited options? Would he ask for power? For wealth? For long life? For victory over his enemies? God was watching to see what Solomon truly valued. This was a test of character, a moment that would reveal what kind of king Solomon would become. And Solomon's answer would determine not just his own future, but the future of an entire nation. Solomon didn't rush to answer. He thought carefully about what to say. And when he spoke, his words revealed a humble heart. 1 Kings 3:6 begins his response. Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day." Solomon started by acknowledging God's goodness to his father. He recognized that he didn't deserve to be king. It was all because of God's kindness. Then Solomon expressed his fear and inadequacy. 1 Kings chapter 3:7 continues, "Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties." Solomon called himself a little child. He wasn't actually a child in age, but he felt like one in experience. He was honest about his limitations. He knew he wasn't ready for this job. 1 Kings 3:8 adds, "Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people too numerous to count or number." He was responsible for millions of people, and he felt the weight of that responsibility crushing down on him. So what did Solomon ask for? 1 Kings 3:9 records his request. "So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" Solomon asked for wisdom, not wealth, not power, not a long life, not victory in battle. He asked for the ability to lead well, to judge fairly, to know the difference between right and wrong. He wanted to be a good king for God's people. This request showed that Solomon's heart was in the right place. He cared more about serving others than serving himself. God was pleased, very pleased. 1 Kings 3:10 says simply, "The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this." God had tested Solomon, and Solomon had passed. He had chosen wisdom over everything else. And because of that choice, God was about to give Solomon more than he could have imagined. 1 Kings 3:11 and 12 record God's response. "So God said to him, 'Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be.'" God promised Solomon unmatched wisdom. No one before him would compare. No one after him would compare. Solomon would be the wisest man who ever lived. But God wasn't finished. 1 Kings 3:13 continues, "Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings." Because Solomon didn't ask for riches, God gave him riches. Because Solomon didn't ask for fame, God gave him fame. God was giving Solomon everything he didn't ask for on top of what he did ask for. This is how God works. When we seek him first, when we prioritize the right things, he adds blessings we never even thought to request. But there was one more thing. 1 Kings 3:14 adds a condition. "And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life." The promise of long life came with an if. Solomon would need to stay faithful. He would need to obey God's commands. If he did, he would live long. This was both a promise and a warning. Everything depended on Solomon's continued faithfulness to God. Solomon woke up from the dream and realized it had been from God. He returned to Jerusalem and offered more sacrifices and threw a feast for his entire court. But the real test of his new wisdom came soon after. 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 16 sets up the scene. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. 2 women from the lowest level of society were about to become part of the most famous court case in history. These weren't nobles or important people. They were prostitutes, women that most people would have ignored or dismissed. But they had a problem that needed solving, and they came to the king. 1 Kings 3:17 and 18 record the first woman's story. One of them said, "Pardon me, my lord. This woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the 2 of us. They lived together, just the 2 of them. They had both given birth within 3 days of each other. No one else was around. No witnesses, no family members, just 2 mothers and 2 babies." Then came the tragedy. 1 Kings 3, s. 19 and 20 continue. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him, so she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born. One baby had died in the night, suffocated accidentally by his mother. And according to this woman, the other mother had switched the babies while she was sleeping. She woke up to find a dead baby next to her, but when she looked closely, she realized it wasn't her son. The second woman immediately disagreed. 1 Kings 3:22 tells us, "The other woman said, 'No, the living one is my son. The dead one is yours.' But the first one insisted, 'No, the dead one is yours. The living one is mine.' And so they argued before the king. Back and forth they went. Each woman claimed the living baby was hers. Each woman said the dead baby belonged to the other. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no DNA tests, no way to prove who was telling the truth. It seemed like an impossible case. How could anyone judge between them? Solomon sat on his throne and thought. Then he made a shocking decision. 1 Kings 3:4 records what happened. Then the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword for the king. Everyone in the court must have been confused. Why did the king need a sword? What was he going to do? The tension in the room was rising. Then Solomon gave an order that made everyone's blood run cold. 1 Kings 3:2 says, "He then gave an order. Cut the living child in 2 and give half to one and half to the other." The entire court held its breath. Was the king serious? Was he really going to kill an innocent baby? It seemed insane. It seemed cruel. But Solomon knew exactly what he was doing. He was creating a test, a moment where the truth would reveal itself through the mother's reactions. And the reactions came immediately. 1 Kings chapter 3:26 records what happened next. The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son, and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." But the other said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in 2. The difference couldn't have been more clear. The real mother would rather lose her son to another woman than see him killed. Her love was so strong that she was willing to give him up if it meant he would live. She cried out in anguish, begging the king to spare the child. But the false mother had no such love. She coldly agreed to the division. If she couldn't have the baby, then no one would. Her response revealed a heart without maternal love, without compassion, without truth. Solomon had his answer. 1 Kings 3:27 tells us, "Then the king gave his ruling. Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother." It was that simple. Solomon identified the true mother by watching who loved the child more. The woman willing to sacrifice her own claim was the real mother. The woman willing to let the child die was the liar. Solomon's wisdom wasn't just about knowledge. It was about understanding human nature, about knowing that real love always protects, always hopes, always perseveres. The news of this judgment spread fast. 1 Kings 3:28 says, When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. One case, one decision. And the entire nation knew that something special was happening in Israel. God had given them a king who could see through lies, who could find truth in impossible situations, who had divine wisdom flowing through him. Solomon's reputation was established. He wasn't just a king by birth, he was a king by God's choosing and God's gifting. But Solomon's destiny involved more than just judging cases. There was a bigger project waiting for him, a dream that his father David had carried but never fulfilled. David had loved God deeply and wanted to build a permanent house for God's presence. The Ark of the Covenant was still in a tent, and David thought this was wrong. 1 Chronicles 22:7 records David's words to Solomon, "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God." David had planned it. He had wanted it. He had dreamed about it, but God had said no to David. 1 Chronicles 22, verse 8 records God's reason. "But this word of the Lord came to me, you have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight." David was a warrior. He had killed many men in battle. His hands were stained with blood, not because he was evil, but because that was his role. God had used David to establish Israel's kingdom through warfare. But because of all that bloodshed, David couldn't build God's house. That honor would go to someone else. 1 Chronicles 22:9 reveals who that someone would be. "But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign." God had told David that Solomon would be the builder. Solomon, whose name meant peace, would build the temple during a time of peace. This was God's plan all along. So David prepared everything he could for Solomon. He couldn't build the temple himself, but he could gather the materials. And David gathered like no one had ever gathered before. 1 Chronicles 22:14 records what David told Solomon. "I have taken great pains to provide for the temple of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, quantities of bronze and iron too great to be weighed, and wood and stone, and you may add to them." Let's put this in perspective. 100,000 talents of gold is about 350 tons of gold. 1,000,000 talents of silver is about 37500 tons of silver. This was an unimaginable fortune, more wealth than most kingdoms possessed in total. And David had set it all aside for one purpose, building God's house. But David gave Solomon more than just materials. He gave him detailed plans. 1 Chronicles 28:1 says, "Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the portico of the temple, its buildings, its storerooms, its upper parts, its inner rooms, and the place of atonement." David had received these plans from God. 1 Chronicles 28:19 adds, "All this David said I have in writing as a result of the Lord's hand on me, and he enabled me to understand all the details of the plan. These weren't human designs. These were divine blueprints." God had shown David exactly how the temple should be built, and now David was passing these plans to Solomon. David charged Solomon with this sacred responsibility. 1 Chronicles 22:2-6 and 7 record the moment. "Then he called for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, 'My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God.'" This was David's dying wish, his final command to his son. Build the temple. Honor God. Complete what I couldn't complete. The dream was passing from father to son. Solomon was ready to fulfill his father's dream. In the 4th year of his reign, he began the greatest building project in Israel's history. 1 Kings 6:1 tells us exactly when, in the 480th year, after the Israelites came out of Egypt. In the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. The location was significant. 2 Chronicles 3:1 says, "Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Arona, the Jebusite, the place provided by David. This was the same spot where David had built an altar to stop a plague. It was the same mountain where Abraham had been willing to sacrifice Isaac centuries before. This ground was sacred. The project required a massive workforce. 1 Kings 5:13 records the labor force. King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. These weren't slaves. They were Israelites doing shifts of work. 1 Kings 5:14 explains the rotation. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Donam was in charge of the forced labor. 1 month working, 2 months home with their families. But that wasn't all. 2 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 2 adds more numbers. Solomon conscripted 70,000 men as carriers and 80,000 as stonecutters in the hills. That's 180,000 workers total, not counting supervisors and craftsmen. The materials came from various sources. Solomon made a deal with King Hiram of Tyre for the cedar wood. 1 Kings 5:8. 9 record Hiram's response. So Hiram sent word to Solomon, "I have received the message you sent me and will do all you want in providing the cedar and juniper logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea, and I will float them as rafts by sea to the place you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away." The cedars of Lebanon were famous throughout the ancient world for their quality and size. These trees would form the framework and paneling of God's house. The construction took 7 years. 1 Kings 6:38 tells us, "In the 11th year, in the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished in all its details, according to its specifications. He had spent 7 years building it. 7 years of cutting stone, hauling timber, carving wood, and placing every piece exactly according to the plans God had give. N. David. Every detail mattered. Every measurement was precise. This wasn't just a building. This was God's dwelling place on earth. The temple itself was stunning, but what made it truly breathtaking was the gold. So much gold. 1 Kings 6:20 describes the inner sanctuary. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide and 20 high. He overlaid the inside with pure gold, and he also overlaid the altar of cedar. The most holy place was completely covered in gold. But it wasn't just the inner room. 1 Kings chapter 6:22 adds, "So he overlaid the whole interior with gold. He also overlaid with gold the altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary." How much gold are we talking about? 2 Chronicles 3:8 gives us the number. He overlaid the most holy place with 600 talents of fine gold. 600 talents is about 23 tons of pure gold, just for one room. The entire interior was covered. 1 Kings 6:30 tells us, "He also covered the floors of both the inner and outer rooms of the temple with gold. Even the floor was gold. You couldn't walk in this temple without stepping on gold." The decorations were elaborate. 1 Kings 6:29 says, "On the walls all around the temple, in both the inner and outer rooms, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers." These weren't simple carvings. They were works of art, and every carving was covered in gold. The cherubim were angels. The palm trees represented life and victory. The flowers showed beauty and God's creation. Every wall told a story of God's glory. But the most impressive features were the 2 giant cherubim in the most holy place. 1 Kings 6:23-28 described them. For the inner sanctuary he made a pair of cherubim out of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. One wing of the first cherub was 5 cubits long, and the other wing 5 cubits 10 cubits from wingtip to wingtip. The second cherub also measured 10 cubits, for the 2 cherubim were identical in size and shape. The height of each cherub was 10 cubits. He placed the cherubim inside the innermost room of the temple, with their wings spread out. The wing of one cherub touched one wall, while the wing of the other touched the other wall, and their wings touched each other in the middle of the room. He overlaid the cherubim with gold. These angels were 15 feet tall, with 15 feet wingspans, covered entirely in gold, their wings stretching from wall to wall, over the Ark of the Covenant. They were guardians, protectors of God's presence when the construction was finally complete. It was time for the most important moment, bringing the Ark of the Covenant to its new home. The Ark had been in a tent for decades, ever since David brought it to Jerusalem. Now it would rest in the temple. 1 Kings 8:1 tells us, "Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring up the Ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. This wasn't a private ceremony. Solomon gathered all the leaders of Israel. Everyone needed to witness this. 1 Kings 8:3-4 described the procession when all the elders of Israel had arrived. The priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord, and the tent of meeting, and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and Levites carried them up. Only the priests could touch the ark. This was sacred, holy, dangerous. Years before, a man named Uzzah had touched the ark to steady it and died instantly. God's holiness was not to be treated casually. The priests carried it carefully into the temple. 1 Kings 8:6-7 continue. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. The ark was home. It was in the place God had designed for it, under the wings of the golden cherubim, in the most holy place covered with gold. Then something incredible happened. As the priests came out of the holy place, God showed up. 1 Kings 8:10-11 record the moment when the priests withdrew from the holy place. The cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. The same cloud that had led Israel through the desert, the same cloud that had filled the tabernacle now filled Solomon's temple. It was so thick, so heavy with God's presence, that the priests couldn't even do their jobs. They had to stop and step back. God had moved in. The temple wasn't just a beautiful building anymore. It was the dwelling place of the Almighty. With God's house complete, Solomon turned his attention to his own house, and he didn't hold back. 1 Kings 7:1 tells us something surprising. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. 13 years for his palace, 7 years for God's temple. Solomon spent almost twice as long building his own residence as he did building God's house. This gives us a hint of what was to come in Solomon's life. But for now, the palace was simply magnificent. The main building was called the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon, because of all the cedar pillars. 1 Kings chapter 7:2 describes it. He built the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high, with 4 rows of cedar columns, supporting trimmed cedar beams. Converting the measurements, that's about 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. This was a massive structure, with forests of 2 Chronicles 9:1-19 emphasizes the uniqueness. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. This throne was one of a kind. When foreign ambassadors came to visit Solomon, when other kings sent representatives, they would see this throne and know they were dealing with someone extraordinary. The throne became famous throughout the known world, a symbol of Solomon's wealth and power. But Solomon's wealth didn't come just from taxation. He was a brilliant businessman who understood international trade. Solomon built a fleet of ships to bring back treasures from distant lands. 1 Kings 9:26 tells us where King Solomon also built ships at Etzion Gabba, which is near Elath in Edom, on the shore of the Red Sea. Etzion Gabba was at the northern tip of the Red Sea, giving Solomon access to trade routes that went south along the African coast and east toward India. But Solomon had a problem. Israelites weren't sailors, they were farmers and shepherds, not seafarers. So Solomon made another deal with King Hiram. 1 Kings chapter 9:27 says, "And Hiram sent his men, sailors, who knew the sea, to serve in the fleet with Solomon's men. The Phoenicians from Tyre were famous sailors who had been navigating the Mediterranean and beyond for generations. They knew the winds, the currents, the routes. They knew how to handle ships in storms and how to navigate by the stars. Solomon provided the ships and the trade goods. Hiram provided the expertise." Where did the ships go? 1 Kings 9:28 tells us one destination. They sailed to Oyer and brought back 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon. Ov was famous for its gold. The exact location is debated today, possibly in Africa, Arabia, or even India. But wherever it was rich. 420 talents is about 16 tons of gold from a single voyage. But gold wasn't the only cargo. 1 Kings 10:22 describes the full fleet. The king had a fleet of trading ships at sea, along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years it returned carrying gold, silver and ivory, and apes and baboons. Every 3 years, the ships would return loaded with treasures, gold and silver for the treasury, ivory for carving thrones and decorations, apes and baboons as exotic animals that would amaze visitors to Solomon's court. These voyages made Solomon incredibly wealthy and brought Jerusalem goods that no one in Israel had ever seen before. Solomon didn't just focus on wealth and wisdom. He also built military strength. He understood that peace required power. 1 Kings 10:26 gives us the numbers. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities, and also with him in Jerusalem. Chariots were the cutting-edge military technology of the time. They were fast, powerful, and intimidating. Having 1,400 chariots meant Solomon had the most modern army in the region. But chariots required infrastructure. You couldn't just park them anywhere. 1 Kings 9, Solomon built as well as all his store, cities and the towns for his chariots and for his horses. Whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and throughout all the territory he ruled, Solomon constructed special cities just for his chariots and cavalry. Archaeological discoveries have found these chariot cities. They had special stables with stone mangers, storage rooms for equipment, and training grounds. 2 Chronicles chapter 9 verse 25 adds a detail. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots and 12,000 horses. 4,000 stalls means Solomon's military installations were huge. These weren't small outposts. They were major fortifications. 1 Kings 9:15 lists some of them. Here is the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple. His own palace, the terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Giza. Hazor, Megiddo, and Giza were 3 strategic cities that guarded important routes through Israel. Solomon fortified them and stationed chariots there. But Solomon also saw chariots as a business opportunity. 1 Kings 10:28 and 29 explain, Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kuwait. The royal merchants purchased them from Kuwait at the current price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Arameans. Solomon was running an international arms trade. He bought chariots from Egypt and horses from Kay, then resold them to other kingdoms at a profit. He was making money from his military while making money off other people's militaries. Solomon's fame spread far and wide. Stories of his wisdom and wealth traveled along the trade routes. And one person who heard these stories was the Queen of Sheba. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 1 tells us what she did. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. Sheba was probably in southern Arabia, modern-day Yemen, about 1/200th from Jerusalem. This queen didn't just send a messenger. She came herself with a full royal caravan. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 2 describes her arrival, arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold, and precious stones. She came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. This wasn't a small group. This was a massive caravan that would have taken months to prepare and months to travel. She brought diplomatic gifts, but she also brought questions. She wanted to test Solomon to see if the reports about his wisdom were true or exaggerated. 1 Kings chapter 10:3 gives us Solomon's performance. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. Every question she asked, Solomon had an answer. Every riddle she posed, he solved. Every complex problem she presented, he unraveled. The queen had probably prepared her hardest questions, things that would stump most scholars. But Solomon handled them all. However, it wasn't just his wisdom that impressed her. 1 Kings 10:4 and 5 describe her reaction to everything. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. The palace, the organization of his court, the quality of the food, the uniforms of theatre, servants, the worship at the temple, every detail was perfect. Every aspect of Solomon's kingdom was functioning at the highest level. 1 Kings 10, S6, 7 record her words to Solomon. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard." This was high praise from a queen who had traveled 1 mile specifically to verify the reports. She admitted that she had been skeptical, that she thought the stories were exaggerated. But seeing it herself, she realized the reality exceeded the rumors. 1 Kings 10:9 shows her final blessing. "Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." Even this foreign queen recognized that Solomon's success came from God. Solomon's collection of wives didn't start as lust or obsession. It started as politics. In the ancient world, marriages between royal families were how kings made alliances and prevented wars. When two kingdoms wanted peace, they sealed it with a wedding. The more wives a king had from different nations, the more alliances he had, and Solomon was building an empire. His first major political marriage was significant. 1 Kings 3:1 tells us, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. This was unprecedented. Egyptian pharaohs rarely let their daughters marry foreign kings. Egypt considered itself superior to all other nations. For Pharaoh to give his daughter to Solomon showed just how powerful and respected Solomon had become. But Solomon didn't treat her like just. 1 Kings 7:8 says, "And the palace in which he was to live set farther back was similar in design." Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. Solomon built her a separate palace. This wasn't just a room in the harem. This was her own royal residence, showing her special status. She was the daughter of the most powerful king in the world at that time. And Solomon honored that. 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 24 adds another detail. After Pharaoh's daughter had come up from the city of David to the palace Solomon had built for her, he constructed the terraces. Solomon even changed Jerusalem's landscape for her. He built special terraces, probably gardens and walkways to make her feel at home. At this point, the marriage seemed like a brilliant diplomatic move. Solomon had secured peace with Egypt, the superpower of the age, but this was just the beginning. One wife became 2, 2 became 10, 10 became 50. And with each new marriage, Solomon was making a choice that would eventually destroy everything he had built. As Solomon's power grew, so did his collection of wives. Each new alliance meant another wedding. Each treaty meant another princess. And Solomon couldn't say no. Or maybe he didn't want to say no. The number grew and grew until it reached a level that's hard to believe. 1 Kings 11:3 gives us the shocking total. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. 700 wives, 300 concubines. That's 1,000 women in Solomon's household. To put this in perspective, that means Solomon could have been with a different woman every single day for almost 3 years before seeing the same one twice. But here's the problem. God had given Israel clear warnings about this very thing. When Moses laid out the laws for Israel's future kings in Deuteronomy 17 verses 16 and 17, he said, "The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold." 3 specific warnings for kings. Don't accumulate horses, don't take many wives, don't pile up wealth. And Solomon broke all 3. He had 12,000 horses, he had 1,000 women. He had more gold than anyone could count. He violated every single warning God had given. And these weren't just any women. 1 Kings 11, S1 and 2 tell us where they came from. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women, besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermark with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them. in love. God had specifically told Israel not to marry people from these nations, not because of racism or prejudice, but because these nations worshipped false gods. And God knew that marriage would influence Israel to worship those gods too. But Solomon ignored the warning. He married them anyway. And the text says he held fast to them in love. He wasn't just making political alliances anymore. He loved these women. He was attached to them, and they were about to lead him away from the God who had given him everything. Each foreign wife brought more than just herself into Solomon's household. She brought her religion, her customs, her gods, and Solomon let her. At first, it probably seemed harmless. Let each wife worship her own way. Don't force them to give up their beliefs. Be tolerant. Be understanding. Tolerance became acceptance. Acceptance became participation. And participation became full-blown idolatry. These wives didn't just pray quietly in their rooms. They established public shrines and altars to their gods right in Jerusalem, the city of God's temple. 1 Kings 11:4 tells us what happened as Solomon grew old. His wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Solomon's heart, the heart that had once asked only for wisdom, was now divided. He was trying to serve God and serve other gods at the same time. And that never works. 1 Kings 11 verse 5 names specific false gods. He followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Ashtaroth was a fertility goddess. Her worship involved sexual rituals and prostitution. Molech was even worse. Molech worship required child sacrifice. Parents would burn their children alive as offerings to this demon. And Solomon, the wisest man in the world, the builder of God's temple, was now following these evil gods. How did it happen? Slowly, gradually, one compromise at a time. Maybe at first he just attended his wife's ceremonies out of politeness. Then maybe he started offering incense to keep them happy. Then maybe he started actually praying to these gods. The text doesn't give us the details, but it shows us the end result. Solomon's heart was turned away. 1 Kings 11 verse 7 tells us how far Solomon went on a hill east of Jerusalem. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. A high place was an altar on a hilltop where sacrifices were offered, and Solomon built these high places right outside Jerusalem. When people looked out from the city, when they looked out from the temple, they could see these pagan altars on the hill. The man who had built God's house was now building houses for demons. 1 Kings 11:8 adds, he did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Solomon built shrines for all of them. The palace complex became a religious marketplace with gods from every nation competing for worship. And God, the true God who had given Solomon everything, was being pushed to the side. This wasn't just political tolerance anymore. Solomon's heart had actually turned. The man who had once walked with God was now walking away from God. 1 Kings 11:6 describes the tragedy. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. David had been far from perfect. David had committed adultery and murder, but David's heart always came back to God. When Nathan confronted David, David repented immediately. David wrote Psalm 51, crying out, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." David's heart was always pointed toward God, even when his actions failed. But Solomon was different. Solomon's heart had turned away. He didn't repent, he didn't cry out to God. He just kept following other gods alongside the true God. The description gets more specific. 1 Kings 11:5 had mentioned Asht and Molech. Now 1 Kings 11 verse 7 adds Chemosh on a hill east of Jerusalem. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab. Chemosh was the national god of Moab. Like Molech, Chemosh sometimes required child sacrifice. The prophet Jeremiah would later describe the valley where these sacrifices happened as a place of horror. And Solomon, in his old age with all his wisdom, was building altars for these gods. The text emphasizes the location on a hill east of Jerusalem. This mattered because the temple was in Jerusalem. When tens and worshippers went to the temple to offer sacrifices to the true God, they could look east and see the high places Solomon had built for false gods. It was a visible betrayal, a public statement that Solomon no longer cared about honoring God alone. What makes this even more tragic is that Solomon knew better. He had more wisdom than anyone who ever lived. He knew what God required. He had written much of Proverbs with warnings about the dangers of sexual immorality and foolish choices. He had written Ecclesiastes, reflecting on the emptiness of chasing pleasure. But knowledge isn't the same as obedience. Wisdom isn't the same as faithfulness. Solomon knew the truth, but he didn't live it. His wives had captured his heart in a way that wisdom couldn't protect him from. 1 Kings 11:4 says, "His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been." Half-hearted devotion is no devotion at all. God doesn't want part of our hearts. He wants all of it. And Solomon was giving pieces of his heart to 1,000 different women and their gods. God had been patient with Solomon. God had given him everything: wisdom, wealth, honor, peace. God had appeared to him twice, once in the dream at Gibeon and once after the temple dedication. God had made promises to Solomon and blessed him beyond measure. But now God's patience was ending. 1 Kings 11:9 tells us, "The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice." God's anger was justified. This wasn't a small mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was deliberate, sustained rebellion. And it was worse because God had appeared to Solomon twice. Solomon had seen God's glory fill the temple. He had experienced God's presence in ways most people never would. And still, he turned away. 1 Kings 11:10 adds, "Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command." God had specifically commanded Solomon not to do this. It wasn't unclear. It wasn't ambiguous. God had said, "Don't worship other gods." And Solomon did it anyway. So God took action. He didn't strike Solomon dead. He didn't destroy Jerusalem, but he did raise up enemies to make Solomon's life difficult. 1 Kings 11:14 says, "Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom." Hadad was an Edomite prince who had escaped when David conquered Edom years earlier. He had been living in Egypt, but now he returned to cause trouble for Solomon. 1 Kings 11:23 mentions another enemy. "And God raised up against Solomon another adversary, Rezin, son of Eliada, who had fled from his master, Hadassah, king of Zobah. Rezin gathered men around him and became the leader of a rebel band." 1 Kings 11:25 tells us what happened. Rezin was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezin ruled in Haram and was hostile toward Israel. Solomon, who had enjoyed peace his entire reign, was now facing opposition from multiple sides. The peace was cracking. The kingdom was becoming unstable. And it was all because Solomon had turned his heart away from God. But the most dangerous enemy wasn't outside Israel. It was inside. 1 Kings 11:26 introduces him. "Also, Jeroboam son of Nebat rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zerida, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah." Jeroboam wasn't a foreign enemy. He was one of Solomon's own men, a capable administrator who had caught Solomon's attention. 1 Kings 11:28 tells us, "Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole bore force of the tribes of Joseph." Solomon had promoted Jeroboam, trusted him with important responsibilities. But Jeroboam was about to become the instrument of Solomon's dynasty's destruction. One day, Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem when something unexpected happened. 1 Kings 11:29 sets the scene. About that time Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country. Ahijah was a prophet, a spokesman for God, and he had a message for Jeroboam. But this message wasn't delivered in words alone. It was delivered through a dramatic action. 1 Kings 11:30 describes it, "And Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then Ahijah spoke." 1 Kings 11:31 records his words. "Then he said to Jeroboam, 'Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. Now, The 12 pieces represented the 12 tribes of Israel. 10 pieces for Jeroboam meant 10 tribes would be his. This was God's judgment on Solomon. The kingdom was going to be ripped apart, divided, torn in two. And it would happen because Solomon had torn his own heart away from God. But God wasn't completely rejecting Solomon's family. 1 Kings 11:32 explains, "But for the sake of my servant David, and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe. One tribe would remain with Solomon's son." Not because Solomon deserved it, but because of David. God had made a promise to David that his family would always have a descendant on the throne. And God keeps his promises even when people break theirs. 1 Kings 11:33 gives the reason for this judgment. "I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtaroth, goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did." God wasn't going to do this immediately. 1 Kings 11:34 says, "But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life, for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose, and who obeyed my commands and decrees." Solomon would remain king until he died. But after his death, the kingdom would split. 1 Kings 11:35 concludes, "I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes." Jeroboam now knew his future. He would be king over most of Israel. And Solomon somehow found out about this prophecy. 1 Kings 11:40 tells us Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death. Solomon, in fear and anger, tried to eliminate the threat, but Jeroboam escaped, and the prophecy remained. The judgment was coming, and nothing Solomon could do would stop it. Part of the reason God was judging Solomon wasn't just the idolatry, it was also the burden Solomon had placed on his people. All those building projects, all that gold, all those horses and chariots, all those wives, someone had to pay for it. And that someone was the people of Israel. Solomon had set up an elaborate system of taxation and forced labor that was crushing his subjects. 1 Kings 4:7 explains the system. Solomon had 12 district governors over all Israel who supplied provisions for the king and the royal household. Each one had to provide supplies for 1 month in the year. Israel was divided into 12 districts, and each district had to supply everything the royal household needed for 1 month. That meant every district was responsible for feeding Solomon, his family, his officials, and his army for 30 days every year. And the amount required was staggering. 1 Kings 4:22 lists the daily provisions. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores of the finest flour and 60 cores of meal. Converting these measurements, that's about 185 bushels of fine flour and 375 bushels of regular meal every single day. That's just the grain. 1 Kings 4:23 continues, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. Every day Solomon's household consumed 10 fattened cattle, 20 cattle from the fields, 100 sheep and goats, plus wild game and birds. This was a feast every single day, and the people had to provide it all. But that wasn't all. There was also forced labor. Solomon needed workers for his building projects, and he conscripted them from the Israelite population. 1 Kings 5:13 told us earlier that King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. These men had to leave their homes, their farms, their families, for months at a time to work on Solomon's projects. 1 Kings 5:14 explained the rotation. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. 1 month working, 2 months home. It sounds reasonable until you realize this affected tens of thousands of families. Farms suffered, businesses struggled, family life was disrupted. All so Solomon could have more palaces and more luxuries. The burden was heavy, and the people felt it. They didn't complain openly while Solomon was alive, because he was too powerful, too respected, but the resentment was building. The anger was growing, and when Solomon died, all that frustration would explode. The seeds of rebellion weren't just in Jeroboam's ambition. They were in the hearts of ordinary people who were tired of being taxed and worked to death for a king who had 1,000 wives and more gold than he could ever use. Solomon's glory came at a cost, and his people were paying it. Solomon reigned for 40 years. 1 Kings 11:42 tells us simply, Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel. 40 years of wisdom, 40 years of wealth, 40 years of building and trading and expanding. But these 40 years ended in compromise and division. The man who had started his reign, asking God for wisdom, ended his reign, turning away from God toward idols. The man who had built God's temple also built shrines for demons. The man who had everything lost what mattered most, his relationship with God. 1 Kings 11:43 records his death. Then Solomon rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king. Solomon died and was buried with honor in Jerusalem. His son Rehoboam became the next king just as dynasties passed from father to son. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but beneath the surface, everything was broken. The kingdom was about to explode into civil war. The unity that David had fought so hard to establish and Solomon had maintained through wealth and power was about to shatter. And why? Because of the 1,000 women. 1 Kings 11:4 had told us, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. The wisest man in the world had been defeated by his own desires. All the knowledge in the world couldn't save him from the choices he made. All the wisdom God had given him couldn't protect him from the consequences of disobedience. Solomon had everything, and he threw it away for women and the gods they brought with them. The tragedy of Solomon's life is that it didn't have to end this way. God had given him very chance. God had blessed him beyond measure. God had warned him. God had appeared to him twice. But Solomon made his choices, and those choices destroyed everything. The united kingdom of Israel that David had fought to build and Solomon had ruled in peace would not last another generation. Rehoboam would be king, but only over a fraction of what his father had ruled. The other 10 tribes would follow Jeroboam, just as the prophet had said. And it all happened because the wisest man in history couldn't control his own heart. If this story impacted you, if it made you think, if it challenged you, then don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more biblical stories that reveal truth about God and about ourselves. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Solomon's warning, and leave a comment below. What lesson from Solomon's life struck you the most? Remember, even the wisest man in history fell when he stopped walking with God. Don't let that be your story.